The morning air was still, cold, too quiet. In the Tower of London, a woman stood tall, though her hands trembled beneath the folds of her grey gown. Her name was Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, once the most desired. Once a queen crowned with golden robes and fiery charm. Now, she was just a body waiting to be separated from its head. The scaffold was freshly built. The wooden planks groaned under the weight of the silent crowd. Nobles, servants, guards, all frozen like statues. Nobody dared speak. Nobody dared breathe. Anne looked straight ahead. Her dark eyes were calm, but not empty. She did not cry. She did not beg. She smiled. And that smile broke the hearts of many who watched, because it wasn't the smile of hope. It was the smile of someone who had accepted death long before the sword was drawn. The executioner, brought in specially from France, held a blade so sharp it glinted like glass in the pale light. There would be no axe, no clumsy swings, no mercy either. Just one perfect slice. Anne had asked for one thing that morning: please don't let me suffer. And this was Henry's answer. As the priest whispered prayers, Anne looked up at the sky. Was she thinking of her daughter Elizabeth? Of the love Henry once promised her? Of the lies that tore her apart? No one would ever know. What they did know was this: just 3 years before, Henry had moved heaven and earth to make Anne Boleyn his queen. He had broken away from the Pope. He had defied the Catholic Church. He had rewritten the laws of England. All for her. And now, here she was, kneeling on cold stone, her neck exposed, her hair tucked away to keep the blade from catching. She whispered her last words: "To Jesus Christ, I commend my soul." Then the executioner cried out in French, "Bring me the sword." Though he already held it, to distract her in her final moment, and in one clean, brutal motion, her head was severed from her body. A burst of blood splashed across the straw-covered ground. Her lips were still moving. Some say she tried to speak. Others say she prayed. But within seconds, her body collapsed like cloth, while her head rolled softly to the side. Her ladies-in-waiting rushed forward, weeping silently, wrapping the remains in white cloth. There was no coffin, no proper burial. Just a wooden arrow box where her body was stuffed like an object. The woman who had once worn crowns, jewels, and silks was buried under the chapel floor, without a marker, without honor. Forgotten. At least that was the plan. But Anne Boleyn would never be forgotten. Her blood soaked into England's history. Her death was not just a punishment, it was a warning, a message, a curse. Henry VIII, the man who had once written her poems and love letters, the man who waited 7 years to make her his queen, had her executed without a single tear. Why? Was it politics? Jealousy? Madness? Or was Henry so obsessed with control, he destroyed the very woman he once worshipped? This is not just a love story. This is a story of power, betrayal, and silence. It is a story where smiles become swords, where queens become ghosts, and where the man who changed the world for love would soon be haunted by what he did to keep his throne. This is the rise and ruin of Anne Boleyn, the Queen Henry VIII loved most, and still sent to the scaffold. And it all began long before the sword was raised, long before her neck ever touched the cold stone of a scaffold. Anne Boleyn was just a clever girl with sharp eyes and sharper dreams. She wasn't born into greatness, not in the way other queens were. Her family, the Boleyns, were wealthy, yes, but they were ambitious, not royal. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from noble blood. But no one looked at baby Anne and said, "Here is the future Queen of England." They expected her to marry well, not to make history. Born around 1501, Anne grew up in a world ruled by men, gold, and bloodlines. But even as a child, she stood out. She wasn't fair-skinned or golden-haired like the English ideal. She had dark features, Black eyes, olive skin, long fingers, and an intense stare. People would later whisper that she had 6 fingers, or a mole that marked her as a witch, but these were lies spun by enemies who feared her. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. Anne was different. And different scared people. When she was around 12, Anne was sent to the Netherlands, then France, not just for status but for education. There, she was trained in the courts of the most sophisticated monarchs in Europe. She learned to read, write, debate, dance, and sing. She learned music, poetry, fashion, and how to charm a room without saying a word. By the time she returned to England, Anne Boleyn was no longer just a nobleman's daughter. She was a living, breathing symbol of elegance, mystery, and intelligence. At court, men noticed her immediately, but not just for her looks. Anne was clever. She spoke French. She could quote philosophers. She could make you feel like the only person in the room, and then embarrass you with a single sentence if you crossed her. She was not soft like other women at court. She was fire, and fire attracts both warmth and fear. It wasn't long before Henry Percy, heir to the powerful Northumberland family, fell in love with her. They secretly promised themselves to each other. But when the king's advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, heard about it, the match was broken. Anne was heartbroken. She left court, ashamed and angry. But fate was far from done with her. In 1525, she caught the eye of someone far more dangerous than a young noble, King Henry VIII. He was nearly 34. She was about 24. At first, she refused him, boldly, repeatedly. Henry was used to women giving in, especially when he showed interest. But Anne said no, not rudely, not with disgust, but with something worse, with patience. She didn't run. She didn't beg. She made him wait. And the longer he waited, the more obsessed he became. He sent her gifts. She sent them back. He wrote her letters, dozens of them, filled with poetry, longing, and desire. Henry was already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. They'd been together for nearly 20 years. But she had failed to give him a male heir, only a daughter. Mary. Henry became convinced his marriage was cursed. He blamed it on marrying his brother's widow. But deep down, he just wanted Anne. Anne saw her chance, but she wasn't foolish. She knew mistresses got thrown aside. Queens held power. So she made a rule: no bed unless I'm queen. Henry's obsession turned into revolution. He begged the Pope to annul his marriage. The Pope refused. So Henry broke away from the Catholic Church. He made himself head of the Church of England, changing the face of religion forever, just to marry one woman. That woman was Anne Boleyn. In 1533, they married in secret. Catherine was thrown aside. Anne was crowned queen. Her coronation was like something out of legend, filled with gold, music, and celebration. She wore robes trimmed with ermine and walked beneath silken canopies. She had done the impossible, risen from nobility to royalty, from court flirt to queen of the realm. But it wasn't just about the crown. Anne had plans. She supported scholars, artists, and thinkers. She gave money to the poor. She was not content to be just a beautiful queen. She wanted to be a wise one. She believed her bloodline would shape England's future. And when she became pregnant, everyone was sure it would be a boy, the heir Henry dreamed of. But fate had other plans. In September 1533, Anne gave birth not to a son, but to a daughter. A tiny red-haired girl named Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed, but Anne promised she would give him a son next time. She had done what no mistress had ever done, turned herself into a queen and birthed a future monarch. She had silenced the world. For now, Anne was at the height of her power. She had the king's love, a crown on her head, and a baby in her arms. She had faced enemies and outwitted them. She had defied the church and survived. She had taken on England itself and won. People at court began to fear her influence. Some said she was too proud. Others whispered she practiced dark magic, But Anne didn't care. She walked tall. She made decisions. She argued with men in council. She had opinions, and she didn't hide them. She was everything a queen should be, and everything a queen wasn't allowed to be in private. Henry still wrote her letters and poems. He called her my beloved, my jewel, my mistress, and friend, but Anne knew better than to believe in forever. She had taken power. Now she had to keep it. What she didn't know was that her throne was built on sand. And the tide was coming in fast. For now, though, the world watched Anne Boleyn not as a doomed queen, but as a dazzling star, burning bright across the dark skies of England. She had become the queen through wit, willpower, and charm, and changed the history of a kingdom by doing so. But all fires, no matter how bright, eventually burn out. And for Anne, the sparks of glory were already beginning to fade. The queen had given birth to a daughter, not a son. That was the first crack. Anne Boleyn had risen higher than any woman in England. But now the walls around her were beginning to shift, quietly, dangerously. She didn't notice it at first. Neither did the king. But history has a way of whispering long before it screams. When Princess Elizabeth was born in 1533, Anne tried to turn disappointment into hope. She told Henry that their next child would be a boy. She was young, healthy, and determined. Henry smiled. He kissed her hand. He said he believed her. But inside, the king's faith was already thinning like old parchment. Anne poured herself into her duties. She threw herself into court life, trying to stay in Henry's favor. She visited Elizabeth often, doting on the baby with real love. She believed that her daughter would be great, and history would prove her right. But back then, England wanted a son. Only a son. A daughter was not a gift. It was a problem. In public, Anne kept her head high. In private, she felt the pressure growing like vines around her throat. She knew Henry's love had limits. He had defied the Pope, split the church, changed the kingdom, all for her. Now he wanted something in return. A male heir. In 1534, Anne became pregnant again. Finally, a second chance. Whispers in the court turned to excitement. If she delivered a boy, her place would be sealed forever. But fate, once again, was unkind. She miscarried. The details were never recorded in full, but the grief was overwhelming. She wept in her chambers. Henry barely came to see her. His disappointment was cold and cutting, and that's when Jane Seymour arrived. Jane was everything. Anne was not. Quiet, obedient. She didn't argue. She didn't dazzle. She bowed, curtsied, and smiled politely. To Henry, she was a breath of fresh air after Anne's fire. At first, Anne wasn't worried. She had taken Henry's heart from another woman before. Why not again? She tried to flirt, tried to laugh with the king, tried to remind him of who she was. But the more she tried, the further Henry drifted. He started avoiding her chambers. He gave gifts to Jane. He dined with her family. The whispers grew louder. Anne's enemies, and there were many, began circling like wolves. The Boleyn family had made many enemies on their way up. Now those enemies wanted blood. Thomas Cromwell, once a friend and ally, began turning against Anne. She had argued with him over money, politics, religion. She wasn't just a queen. She wanted influence. That made her dangerous. And then came the fatal blow. In January 1536, Anne was pregnant again. This was it, her last chance. She knew everything rested on this child. That same month, Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, died. It should have been a moment of victory for Anne. The rival queen was gone. No more battles over legitimacy. But instead, the English people mourned Catherine like a saint. They called her the true queen. They hated Anne, blamed her for Catherine's death, and worse, whispered that she had poisoned her. And then, the nightmare. Just days after Catherine's funeral, Anne suffered a terrible fall. Some say she was shocked by news that Henry had been hurt in a jousting accident. Others say she tripped. But the result was the same. She miscarried again, this time a baby boy. The loss was devastating. Not just for Anne, but for her place on the throne. When she showed Henry the small, lifeless body, he turned away, cold, silent, disgusted. He muttered one sentence that shook Anne to her core. "I see God will not give me male children." He wasn't blaming fate anymore. He was blaming her. Anne broke down in tears. Her heart was already cracking. Her crown was already slipping. The king returned to court, laughing with Jane Seymour. Anne stayed in her rooms, surrounded by whispers. Drowning in loneliness, her enemies were working fast. They began collecting rumors, twisting words, building a trap. Thomas Cromwell knew what the king wanted, even before Henry said it out loud. He wanted freedom, and Cromwell was ready to give it to him at any cost. In April 1536, Anne's world began to collapse. One of her musicians, a man named Mark Smeaton, was arrested, tortured, and under pain and fear, he confessed to something he never did. Sleeping with the Queen. It was a lie, but a useful one. More men were added to the list: Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, even Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. They were accused of adultery, treason, even incest. The charges were wild, twisted, and impossible. But the king didn't blink. Because for Henry, facts didn't matter anymore. Anne had failed to give him a son, and that made her disposable. She was arrested on May 2, 1536, as the guards took her from the palace to the Tower of London. She laughed nervously. "I heard say the king will not come again to me," she said, her voice shaking, and she was right. He never would. The same tower where she had once been welcomed as queen was now her prison. Inside her cold, DMP cell, Anne prayed. She cried. She begged God to protect Elizabeth. She wrote letters, desperate, confused, heartbroken. She kept saying the same words to the women around her: "I am innocent." And she was. But innocence would not save her. At her trial, the court was already against her. The evidence was weak, laughable, even dates that didn't match, accusations with no proof, testimonies that contradicted each other. But it didn't matter. The jury was filled with her enemies. The sentence was already written. Anne Boleyn was found guilty of adultery, incest, and high treason. She would be executed by beheading, not with an axe, but by sword, as a mercy. A French-style execution, swift and clean. It was the king's last gift to her, the woman he once wrote sonnets for, would now die alone. Branded as a liar, a whore, a traitor, the crowds outside whispered in disbelief. Many still loved her. Others were glad to see her fall. But no one could deny the cruelty. Henry VIII had turned on the woman he once changed the world to marry, and the turning point wasn't sudden. It was slow, cruel, quiet. It was a miscarriage, a whispered rumor, a glance toward another woman. It was the cold realization that love, when mixed with power, can become poison. And, in Anne's case, that poison had already begun to burn. Anne Boleyn's final days weren't years, not in the way we think of time. They were weeks, but each day felt like a century of agony, of waiting, of weeping, of wondering how long it takes to fall from a throne into the grave. Locked inside the Tower of London, she was no longer Queen Anne. She was now the concubine, the traitor, the fallen woman. Her apartments, once filled with silks, gold, perfumes, and music, were now stone, straw, shadows, and silence. The walls were damp. The candles barely lit the corners. The cold crept into her bones like rot. No crown sat on her head. No servants rushed to her call. Her world had shrunk to 4 gray walls and the echo of footsteps she could no longer control. The queen who had once debated bishops and scolded kings now whispered to herself in the dark. Some say she prayed constantly. Others say she laughed to herself, not from joy, but from a mind slowly cracking under pressure. Grief does that. So does fear. So does betrayal so deep it turns your own heartbeat into something that hurts. She asked again and again, "Why? Is this happening?" She had seen enemies fall, but she had never imagined her own death would be so planned, so clean, so cold. Her ladies-in-waiting were ordered not to comfort her. They were told to watch, to record her words, to report every sigh, every breakdown, every scream she tried to hold in. She cried some nights. Others she spoke into the darkness, as if Elizabeth could hear her from miles away. "Remember me, daughter. Don't believe what they say about me. I loved you more than life." She barely slept. She stopped eating. Her body weakened. Her hair, once glossy and dark, lost its shine. Her skin grew pale. Her fingers trembled. Her lips cracked from dehydration. And nerves, she vomited from anxiety. She hallucinated from exhaustion. Once, she asked her ladies if the king would visit. They looked down, and she understood Henry had already moved on. He had never looked back. He was already planning his next wedding, even before her trial had ended. To Anne, this wasn't just heartbreak. It was humiliation. The man who had once knelt to kiss her hand now wouldn't even look her in the eyes as she faced death. Each day, she was reminded of what she had lost, not just the crown, but the illusion that she had ever been safe. And then came the trial. A farce. A show. She was led into the great hall, pale, thin, trembling, but her posture was still regal. She held her chin high. She spoke clearly. She defended herself with truth. And that made her look even more dangerous. She denied the charges: adultery, incest, plotting the king's death. The court did not care. The men who sat in judgment, some of them had once bowed to her. Some had flirted with her. Some had praised her beauty. Now they called her a liar, a witch, a traitor. Even her own uncle sat among the judges. He did not defend her. The same men who once toasted her rise now signed her death. The verdict was clear. Guilty. Anne was sentenced to be burned at the stake. Until Henry, in one final twist of power, decided to change her sentence to beheading. French swordsman was summoned. Anne was told the blade would be swift, clean, almost merciful, but the weight was not. She was left in her cell for days. Each day, she was told it might be today. Each morning, she dressed for death and waited. Then, nothing. The execution was delayed once. Then again, her mind began to unravel. She laughed when there was no joy. She cried over nothing. She couldn't eat. She barely spoke. One night, she tore off her cap and clutched her head, whispering, "It won't be long now. They only need to take this." She didn't mean her hair. She meant her head. One lady wrote in her notes that Anne's hands never stopped moving, twisting, shaking, clutching at her stomach. Another said she began reciting the same lines of scripture over and over again until her voice cracked. When she wasn't praying, she was remembering the garden walks with Henry, the poems, the kisses, the thrill of love, the pain of ambition, the promise of forever. The lie of it all. She asked one night if she would be buried properly. The guards didn't answer. Because the truth was worse than silence. There would be no royal tomb, no marble slab, no carved angels to guard her sleep, just a wooden arrow chest, just a grave under the floor, just a nameless ending to a name that had once changed the world. On the morning of her death, Anne Boleyn rose before the sun. She dressed carefully in a gray gown lined with crimson, the color of blood and dignity. Her lips whispered one last prayer as she stepped outside into the cold May air. The tower green was still. Birds sang. The executioner bowed. Anne smiled at her ladies, not to comfort them, but to give herself one last moment of control. "Don't cry," she said. "I am going to meet my fate, and I am ready." And then she knelt. Her hands folded. Her eyes closed. Her heart beat its final rhythm, and in the cold air of morning, the sword flashed, clean, precise, final. But this was not the end. This was the beginning of a haunting. Anne's death was quick, but her shadow lingered. In the halls of the palace, in the nursery of Elizabeth, in the heart of Henry, where something cold had begun to rot. And even now, some say, if you walk through the Tower of London on a foggy morning, you might hear footsteps echo behind you. You might feel a breath on your neck. You might see a figure in gray, headless, silent, walking the path of betrayal again and again. Because queens may fall, but their ghosts never rest. The morning of May 19, 1536, was unnaturally bright. The birds still sang. The sun still rose. But in the Tower of London, everything felt wrong. Too quiet. Too clean. Too final. Anne Boleyn stood tall in her gray gown, lined with crimson. Her hair was tucked beneath a white linen cap. She wore no jewels, no crown, no mark of the queen she had once been. But her eyes, sharp, black, and steady, still carried the fire of someone who had lived like a storm. A wooden scaffold waited for her on Tower Green, clean, polished, freshly built. The same hands that once applauded her coronation now held back tears. Others held back their smiles. Anne's body moved like it had forgotten how to be afraid. But her mind was still racing. She had not eaten. She had barely slept, but she stood, composed, regal, and devastatingly alone. A French swordsman stood to the side, quiet, cold, efficient. He had been brought in specially, chosen because he was the best. Henry wanted the death to be elegant, swift, almost graceful. As if a cleaner cut could hide the cruelty. Anne stepped onto the scaffold. She looked out at the crowd. There were no cheers. No screams, just silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. She gave a short speech, calm, strange, forgiving. I am come hither to die. According to law, I pray God save the king. She praised the man who signed her death. Her words were not love, they were survival. Dignity, defiance wrapped in silk. She knelt. Her hands trembled only once. A lady bound her eyes. Anne adjusted her head slightly, as if to make it easier. And then the swordsman, with one swift, clean motion, ended the life of a queen. No screams, no axe, no delay. Just one clean sound, a soft thud. And then, stillness. Her body collapsed, knees buckling like cloth. Her head rolled gently across the straw. Some say her eyes blinked. Some say her lips moved in prayer. Her blood soaked the wood. And in that moment, the brightest flame in England was gone. Her ladies rushed forward, weeping, hands trembling. There was no coffin, no royal tomb. Just a wooden box used to hold arrows. That was her final bed. They placed her body inside, folding it carefully beside her head. They buried her beneath the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. No name, no stone, no song. The queen who changed a kingdom was buried like a secret. Meanwhile, Henry VIII wore white, not for mourning, but for celebration. By some accounts, he rode away to be with Jane Seymour on the very same day. 11 days later, he married her. Anne was not mentioned, not mourned. The court was ordered to forget. Her portraits were destroyed. Her initials were scraped from walls. Her story written as a warning. She had been the woman he loved most. And now she was the woman he wanted never to exist. But history has a cruel way of keeping what kings try to bury, the people whispered. Always, quietly, but constantly. Some said Anne had cursed the king. That his leg injury, the one that would never heal, began after her death. That the stench from his rotting flesh haunted every chamber he entered. That his soul began to decay the moment hers left her body. Others swore they saw her ghost. A woman in gray, walking the halls of the tower without a head, wandering silently. waiting for justice that never came. Even today, guards at the Tower of London speak of her. Cold drafts in warm rooms. A woman's weeping echoing down stone corridors. A pale figure seen in the moonlight, hands folded, neck exposed, still kneeling. A queen forever frozen in her final moment. There was no public apology. No confession from Henry, no mercy in death. But Anne's revenge came silently, slowly, and not from her own hands. Her daughter, Elizabeth, the child Henry once dismissed as useless, grew up to become the greatest monarch England would ever know. Anne never saw it. But Elizabeth remembered. She wore Anne's ring. She visited her grave. She made England powerful, united, and feared. The irony was brutal. The queen Henry tried to erase, gave birth to the queen that would define him forever. And the men who destroyed Anne, most of them met bitter ends. Mark Smeaton, the musician who confessed under torture, was hanged. George Boleyn, her brother, executed. Thomas Cromwell, the man who built the case, was beheaded just 4 years later. One by one, they fell. Like dominoes lined up by fate, only Henry survived. But he did not live. He decayed. His body bloated. His leg rotted. His heart turned to stone. His eyes became cold, empty. A man haunted by his choices and by the silence of a queen who never begged. He died in 1547, swollen, unloved, and cursed by the memory of 6 wives. But it was Anne's ghost that walked closest behind him. In the end, Anne's death was not just a tragedy. It was a mirror, reflecting everything cruel, beautiful, and broken about power. A woman loved too much. A queen hated too soon. A mother forgotten. A legacy reborn. And as the centuries passed, her name rose again, not in shame, but in glory. Anne Boleyn, the queen who died without justice, became the mother of a golden age. And while kings are buried in splendor, and thrones rise and fall, her story lives in whispers, in stone, in shadow, because some ghosts never leave. In the end, Anne Boleyn's story is not simply one of love or death. It is the story of power, how it lifts, how it crushes, how it forgets. It's about the cost of being bold in a world that punishes boldness, especially in women. Anne was not perfect. She was ambitious, sharp-tongued, proud. But those were the very things that made her survive. Until they made her dangerous. She stepped into a game built for kings and tried to play it by her own rules. For a moment, she won. But in Henry's world, a woman could be queen until she wanted to be more than decoration. She was used, elevated, worshipped, and then discarded. Her worth was tied to her womb. And when that failed, she was sentenced to death. Yet the irony is this: Anne Boleyn did not vanish. She became immortal, not through mercy, not through monuments, but through legacy. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, would rule for 44 years. She would become one of the greatest monarchs in English history, a symbol of strength, of stability, of power in the hands of a woman. And though Elizabeth rarely spoke of her mother in public, she carried her memory like a quiet fire. She wore a ring that secretly held a portrait of Anne inside. She surrounded herself with portraits of strong queens. She never married, never gave her power to a man. She became everything Anne had never been allowed to be. As the historian Eric Ives wrote, Anne Boleyn was the most influential and important queen consort England ever had, because she gave birth not just to a queen, but to an age. Centuries later, the world has changed. Thrones have fallen. Empires have crumbled. But Anne's story still echoes, still haunts, still teaches. It teaches us that power without justice is poison. That love, when twisted by pride, becomes cruelty. That ambition, when not allowed to breathe, can be called evil even when it's only human. It teaches us that legacies are not written by kings, but by truth. And truth always outlives the sword. Henry VIII wanted Anne forgotten, but history remembered. She lives now in books, in stone, in film, in classrooms, in whispered legends. Her name is no longer cursed. It is revered. The public image of Anne was crafted by her enemies, a temptress, a witch, a traitor. But the private reality was far more human. A woman who loved, a mother who dreamed, a queen who dared. And that's the tragedy and the beauty of her story. She wasn't a saint. She wasn't a monster. She was real. And that's what makes her unforgettable. As we leave her story behind, we must ask, what does it mean to rise so high and fall so hard? What does it mean to be remembered more for your end than for your life? And most importantly, what does it say about us that we still hunger for these stories of glory and ruin? Anne Boleyn's tale is not just history, it is a mirror. It reflects the fragility of power, the danger of pride, and the cost of being extraordinary in a world that demands obedience. It reminds us that the crown weighs most heavily not on the head, but on the soul. And sometimes the only way to win in history is to lose in life.